CCEYA, Childcare and Early Years Act, Part 1. The CCEYA is the legislation for licensed childcare in Ontario. Legislation is laws considered collectively. So, throughout Ontario in childcare, you must follow the Childcare and Early Years Act if you have a licensed childcare center for children under the age of 4. We'll reference the early years portal, and we'll also reference the legislative framework. So, in licensed childcare in Ontario, the legislative framework refers to unlicensed childcare. So, within the Ministry of Education, unlicensed childcare is monitored by the Ministry of Education, but not regulated by the Ministry of Education. And there are some bylaws that speak to home childcare and unlicensed childcare within an individual's home. Home childcare providers, they're contracted by licensed agencies. So the home childcare agency is the one that has the relationship with the ministry, but the providers are the ones that are hired and contracted from those agencies to provide care to children and families within the community. Licensed home childcare agencies, these are the individuals that obtain the license. These are the organizations that obtain the license. They are the ones that have to have policies completed. They are the ones that have to make sure the Child Care and Early Years Act is followed. And when there are annual inspections for home child care agencies, the program advisors also go out to the home child care providers' locations and make sure that the policies that the agency has provided are being implemented, and make sure that medication and everything within the Child Care and Early Years Act is being adhered to, is being implemented, and is compliant. So, although the providers are the ones that provide the care to children, the agency is responsible for ensuring that the provider follows the Child Care and Early Years Act, and the ministry is responsible for ensuring that all the records and all the observations that they make on site are showing compliance with the Child Care and Early Years Act. With licensed childcare, these are childcare centers that have children. They can also be nursery schools. They can be, half-day programs. Licensed childcare varies. It can also be Montessori's, various curriculums. But licensed childcare is a childcare center that is licensed to have children on site, on their location. We'll talk more about the setup and layout and space requirements and equipment requirements for licensed childcare, but the legislative framework talks about licensed childcare. So, knowing how many children can be on site at a location, knowing how many qualified staff you need, how many the qualifications and requirements for the supervisor. This all gets outlined in a licensed childcare center. Licensed childcare centers vary in size. They can be as small as 16 children, as small as 8 children, or as large as 300 children. We also have authorized recreational skill building programs. These are monitored by the legislation, and there are parameters around how many hours you can operate a recreational or skill building program without having to obtain a license. So these are programs that are offered for children sometimes under the age of 4 and up to 12 or 13. The reason it has to be regulated and monitored is because they have to make sure there is no overlap with what could be offered in a licensed childcare program. Because within an authorized recreation or skill building program, they are not licensed, they are not monitored, they do not have to follow the CCEYA or the Child Care and Early Years Act. So they have to make sure that it doesn't exceed a certain amount of hours, they're not providing certain services, because then all the requirements under the Child Care and Early Years Act will need to apply. Children and family programs, early on in family centers, These programs are funded by the province. These programs are for children and families in Ontario, and these programs are free. But they do also have a framework, a legislative framework, and they do also have requirements for the early ons in terms of qualified staff, of types of programming, and how they monitor their registration and traffic within those programs. There are different types of licensed childcare in Ontario, and the two types of licensed childcare in Ontario are childcare centers, as I just spoke about, and home childcare agencies. So these are the two. Everything falls basically within these two for licensed childcare. So within childcare centers, even though you might have a before and after school program, in terms of the type of licensed childcare program, they're still considered a childcare center, even though there may not be a physical center, and it might just be a program operating in a school. So that's considered childcare. As I mentioned, there could be nursery schools that are only half day. Those are still considered childcare centers. And various programs like that that operate for up to 6 hours or less than 6 hours, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then the home childcare agency, where the agency hires providers to provide care within their home, and they can have up to a specific amount of children in their homes once they are contracted by a home childcare agency. The two types, so there's two types of licensed childcare and there's two types of licenses. You can have a regular license or a provisional. A regular license is just a license that outlines how many children you have, and it typically does have conditions, which outlines how many children you can have in certain rooms, some parameters typically around screening and screening measures. So a regular license just simply outlines the amount of children you can have, the address you can have. You can operate this licensed childcare program. It outlines your expiry date for your license. It outlines the name that your childcare program is registered under, and it can have conditions as well. Sometimes conditions are punitive. Sometimes conditions are related to what the program or the licensee or owner has not been doing and what they need to do in order to keep and maintain their license without additional progressive enforcement or additional administrative penalties. So some conditions are punitive, but for the most part, conditions are just outlining different parameters and different details about the license for families to see, because it does need to be placed in a conspicuous place, meaning somewhere where families can see it. There are various operational hours for licensed childcare in Ontario. You have 6 or more hours, less than 6 hours, and then extended or overnight hours. 6 or more hours requires different parameters from the CCEYA. So if you have 6 or more hours, there's different parameters for rest for children. There's different parameters for meals. If you have less than 6 hours, you don't need outdoor time. Meals are a little bit different. There is no requirement for a rest period. So there's a lot of different things that apply and things that don't apply when you operate for 6 hours or more or 6 hours or less. There are additional criteria that's required when you have extended hours, meaning you don't operate the typical 7 to 6 or the typical 11-hour day typically in licensed childcare. You operate more than that. Maybe you have an overnight program where children don't go home until 11 p.m. or midnight, or maybe they can stay all night for a 24-hour program. So there are various options for childcare programs. In most cases, programs are typically open 7 to 6, but when there's been some changes, then they might do 8 to 5. It really just depends on the program. And if you're a nursery school program, you might operate less than 6 hours because you're 8:30 to 12, and then your second group of children come at 1 to 3 or something like that. So these are the various licensed childcare options and information for Ontario. We do have tiered licensing inspections, and the province introduced tiered licensing inspections with different checklists, meaning program advisors come in and look at different things based on the tier of that license. So the tier of the license is only really known by the licensee or owner and the ministry, of course. And parents don't know tiers for their programs. It's not something that is publicly shared, but it does help program advisors inspect in specific ways, inspect in specific time frames. So for a tier one license, there is a shorter checklist that really focuses on key critical non-compliances or critical health and safety areas within the checklist. And a license can be issued for up to 2 years, meaning that they may or may not have an inspection for 2 years, but they will have one like drop-in monitoring inspection or interim inspection within that 2 years. But it wouldn't be a full checklist and it wouldn't be the full inspection that they would typically have annually. It would just be a monitoring. And then we have the tier two, and tier two is the abbreviated checklist. So again, it's the same shorter checklist as tier one, but the license is only issued for up to 1 year. As regular. The only difference with a tier two is that there's probably a higher compliance rate. Tier one has a very good compliance rate. Tier two has a pretty, like a great compliance rate for tier one, a good compliance rate for tier two, and has a shorter checklist and up to 1 year. And then tier three, sometimes typically the that tier implies that there have been some compliance concerns that want to be monitored, and they would have the full checklist. So that's the full Child Care and Early Years Act. So every component, every provision in the Child Care and Early Years Act is turned into a checklist, and they would follow and go through the whole thing for a tier three, and only specific things for tier two and specific things for tier one. So that's what it means by abbreviated. It just means shorter. And then for the tier three, you have up to 1 year license, and you get additional compliance monitoring just to ensure that compliance is being met. This is a breakdown of the tier licensing and inspections, and it talks about gathering that data over the 3 years. So when you have an inspection, when you have a full checklist, if you have no non-compliances, everything has been followed in the Child Care and Early Years Act, that gives you a better compliance score, meaning you would have a higher tier. If you have continued critical or different non-compliances throughout your inspections for that 3 year, the compliance score would be very, very high, meaning that you would be in a lower tier. So that would require more frequent inspections, that would require more frequent monitoring, and more of a heightened awareness and focus on ensuring that the program maintains compliance. We are going to also reference the Child Care Licensing Manual. So the manual was designed with the Child Care and Early Years Act, and it kind of breaks down the Child Care and Early Years Act in more common speech, where it's not very much legal jargon. It lets you know what each section's about. It lets you know the intent of each section of the Child Care and Early Years Act. It also lets you know some special tips and special instructions that the ministry might have or want you to be aware of. And it is important that you not only know the Child Care and Early Years Act, but understand the manual, because it is easier to read and easier to flip through to find the information that you are looking for in terms of the regulation, because it will show you the legal side of the regulation, and then it'll show you the reason that this regulation was put into place, how the ministry or program advisors assess compliance from that. So it actually tells you everything. There are no secrets with the Child Care and Early Years Act, and there are no secrets with the manual, and there are no secrets with your inspections. So everything that you see in the manual is what a program advisor will see when they come out to your program. So they will be um, inspecting from what you see in the manual. So, whatever section in the manual is written, that's exactly what they look for. The compliance indicators are exactly what they look for. So, it is very transparent, but many people don't know how to read the manual or don't understand the manual. So, it becomes very much a mystery. But once you know that, it really should take away any sort of hesitance when an inspection is in place, because it is all known information or information that can be known, and not be like something to be fearful of, and not be something that is a mystery, because it's all there. And once an inspection is completed, each licensee, owner, supervisor gets a report. So you know exactly what was looked at, exactly what was not found or found, and exactly what was discussed, because it's always outlined. But the manual is a good tool. I use the manual. I use the manual almost daily in my work. And I encourage you to start looking at the manual and using the manual as well to better understand the legislation. Also, they reference the Ontario regs, so the OREG 137-15, and that's referenced as well, and they sometimes interchange them, but as we spoke about before, the Child Care and Early Years Act is the legislation and the law, and the OREGs are it's basically making that legal act operational, and the steps that we take to implement or to have the legislation implemented within a program. So it makes it just operational. They also have a manual for home childcare. The reason that they have two separate manuals is that the home childcare manual has specific things just for home childcare agencies, and it is slightly different as to the requirements for what they need, the policy they would need to open a home childcare center, or agency, sorry, to open a home childcare agency, the requirements that they might need for, various things like standing bodies of water that you don't need for childcare centers. There's also information about agreements between the agency and a provider that you wouldn't see in a childcare center as well. Different requirements for how medication is stored. Different requirements for how their kind of inspections are completed. So they do have a whole separate manual so that it's easily understood as to what is required for home childcare separately from what is required for childcare centers. It is very different in the sense where you don't have to have a playground for a home childcare agency, and you don't have to have specific square footage for the number of children in a home childcare provider's home or space. So it does really break down the differences between what is required in the Child Care and Early Years Act for a child care center and what would be required for a home child care agency. So policies, there are mandatory policies and procedures, and these are all required by the ministry. All of these documents, all of these policies are required before you open a child care center. You are not permitted to open a licensed child care center if you have not completed all of these policies, if you've not created all of these policies. So you can have a whole building, you can have everything you want ready, but if you don't have your actual policies and procedures, you actually cannot finish the application. So we are going to look at policies and procedures because all of these are significant to the Child Care and Early Years Act, and all of these are significant to child care centers, and all of these are significant to educators, students, and volunteers. So these are the things that everybody needs to know for the health, safety, and well-being of children and staff within a program. So we will review these and look at this information as to what policies are required, what is the main information in the policies, and how is it implemented, and how are they assessed. So we do have a policy sample. There is a licensing kit on the Early Years portal, and this licensing kit actually has a template of every single required license from the Child Care and Early Years Act, and every single required license for a individual who would like to open and operate a child care center or home child care agency. And it has everything that is needed within the policy. And individuals will just have to add their information to the policy in terms of the name of the center, who's responsible for what, and basically the policies are ready to go. But individuals, staff, owners, operators will need to actually know what is involved in these policies, know what these policies say, know how to read the policies, and know how to inform their staff as to how you implement these policies. So it's important that even though the kit does provide the template, it's important to know what the actual requirements are within the policies and what they state and how to implement them. So with the required policies, we do have a program statement. We do have program statement implementation. There is policies and procedures for monitoring compliance. The supervision of volunteers and students policy is also required. Staff training and development. We have fire safety evacuation procedures. We have emergency management procedures. And then we have wait lists, parent issues and concerns, outdoor play supervision, as well as anaphylaxis, medication, screening as well. So these are all the policies that we have and that are required. And we also have serious occurrence policy that needs to be ensured that that's followed and understood, and sleep policy and supervision. So these are all the required policies, and these are all the requirements of the Child Care and Early Years Act, at minimum to start or open an application, to own or operate a child care center. And these are all the policies and procedures that are required for staff, and are required for staff to implement and know when they are in a licensed child care center in Ontario.